Now, Clash Royale just recently dropped a set of balance changes, and oh my goodness, some absolutely crazy decks have become some of the most popular. Let's go ahead and take a look today at the top 5 decks in Clash Royale for June of 2022. Let's get right into it. Number 1. Giant Skeleton Bridge Spam. That's right, the big winner of this set of balance changes is the Giant Skeleton. Now, this Giant Skeleton Bridge Spam deck is absolutely crazy because it is such a fast and high pressure deck. Starting off the match, I'm always going to be cycling some of my cards. The whole goal of this deck is to constantly be on the offensive end of the match, and in an ideal world, your opponent will simply be defending the entire time. So of course, you have quick pressure cards such as the Ghost and the Goblin Drill that can be used to just apply some quick pressure by themselves, and you also have other cards such as the Golden Knight, the Skeletons, or the Magic Archer that can just kind of be cycled in the back on their own or in response to something that your opponent plays. Now, if your opponent plays some sort of big commitment in the back, go and pressure hard in the opposite lane. After all, it is a bridge spam deck, and so the entire idea is to prevent your opponent from building these pushes by pressuring the opposite lane. But that being said, on the defensive end, this deck can definitely hold. First off, we have the Magic Archer and Ewiz, which are extremely effective against air decks, and against ground, well, we have the Giant Skeleton, the Royal Ghost, and the Golden Knight, which are extremely solid, and the Giant Skeleton's bomb is honestly extremely underrated, and with its recent damage buff, just makes it such a solid card on defense. Finally, of course, we have the Goblin Drill on defense. Against certain air decks or beatdown decks, a defensive Goblin Drill is going to be extremely important to actually defend these pushes. But keep in mind, this deck does have a pretty fast cycle, so oftentimes, if you cycled a Goblin Drill on the tower early enough, you'll very likely be able to cycle back to a second Goblin Drill to actually successfully complete your defense. Last but not least, there is the Tornado, which sort of replaces any sort of spell in this deck. The Tornado is extremely good at getting King Tower activations, and if you pair it with the Magic Archer, it can kind of serve as a spell if you're good at lining that Magic Archer up to get shots onto the tower. Number 2. Electro Giant Beatdown. That's right, with the recent buff to the Electro Giant is officially back and cheaper than ever because it is now 7 elixir. Starting off this match, I'm always going to be on the passive side, right? After all, this is a beatdown deck, so the whole goal is to build up a slight elixir advantage and then turn that elixir advantage into a massive push to steamroll your opponent's towers. So starting off on the defensive end, of course, you have the Goblin Cage, which is going to be your most important tool. It's going to pull all of the opponent's win conditions while buying time for your other defensive troops, such as the Bomber and Golden Knight for ground, and the Inferno Dragon and the Fire Spirit for air. Again, here you also have the Tornado, which can group units up, and the Lightning, which can be used in a pinch if you just absolutely have no other option. Now, the Golden Knight and the Inferno Dragon are relatively tanky defensive units, so oftentimes they will survive a defense, and so if you have the available elixir after a defense, well then definitely go in with an Electro Giant in on offense, and this is where we begin talking about this deck's offense. This deck is a beatdown deck, so the pushes are relatively self-explanatory, right? You have your Electro Giant up front and your support units behind, but that doesn't mean you can't build a hybrid bridge spam style of push, because the Golden Knight and the Goblin Brawler from the Cage are both extremely fast and high pressure units that you can play. In addition, on offense, your spells are going to be essential to getting an Electro Giant push to the tower. Not only do you have the Lightning to take out medium to high health units that the opponents have, but you also have the Tornado, which can pull units into that Electro Giant range, or even line units up so that the Golden Knight can dash onto the arena tower. The beatdown style of this deck makes it extremely easy to pick up, so it's going to be one of my top choices for this next meta. Number 3. Royal Giant Control. And again, we have another deck where we're seeing a Giant Skeleton in it. This Royal Giant deck is extremely effective, and the control aspect allows you to build up massive positive elixir trades. So starting off the match, I'm generally going to be pretty passive. The win conditions in this deck are a bit more on the expensive side, so of course you're not going to start off the match playing a Royal Giant at the bridge. And usually starting off the match, I will generally just react and defend to an opponent's initial push. So on the defensive end, you have the Archer Queen for air defense, the Giant Skeleton and Royal Ghost for ground defense, and the Fisherman to pull any building targeting units away. Now while these are good options, the defense of this deck does have two pretty big weaknesses. The first is against air decks, right? You only have the Archer Queen. The second issue is any sort of building targeting unit such as the Hog Rider or the Golem. With these, it is extremely important that you identify the matchup and save your Archer Queens and Fishermans accordingly. Moving on to the offensive end of this deck, ideally at this point you've built up a bit of an elixir advantage or a counter push with surviving units from a defense. At this point, your Royal Giant pushes have two different types. You have a beatdown style of push and you have a bridge spam style of push. Oftentimes, if you have elixir and surviving units, we'll then go in with that Royal Giant at the bridge. And of course, try to support it with that Fisherman to pull away any sort of high output damage units that your opponents might have. Alternatively, you can build up a Royal Giant push in the back. This may be a little bit better of an option against cycle decks because the beatdown style has always been difficult for them to counter. All in all, the offense of this deck is extremely versatile and the defense is super solid, so definitely another easy deck to pick up and play. Number 4, Lava Hound Spam. And of course, as usual, Lava Hound is doing very well in this meta. There are tons of variants of Lava Hound. In my opinion, this one is the most solid and consistent. As with most Lava Hound decks, it is an extremely aggressive style of play. Starting off the match, you always want to try to be on the aggressive end of the match. Maybe that even means going in with a Lava Hound at the first play because Lava Hound is just that good. When it comes to building up your Lava Hound pushes, I have a couple of tips. The first is to never go all in until the opponent uses their medium or large spell. This is because a lot of your Lava Hound units are extremely weak to medium and large spells such as the Fireball and the Rocket. So oftentimes when I go in with a Lava Hound, I will just support it with 1 or maybe 2 support units at most. And this will force your opponents in an uncomfortable position. Do they want to use their medium spell now and then risk you going all in as soon as that medium spell is out of cycle? In addition, if you're not going all in on your Lava Hound pushes, then you also have extra elixir to go in with a Fireball or a Zap reactively, meaning that your pushes will be a lot more deadly since you can take down the opponent's air counters much quicker. On the defensive end of this deck is where things can get a little bit more sketchy because it's so offensive oriented, and because this deck has so many air units, you're gonna have to be really careful with how you're playing your Tombstones and your Mighty Miners, using them sort of as distractions while your other air units can damage those troops down. Last but not least, never forget that a good defense can also be an offense. If your opponent has a gigantic push coming your way and you simply do not have the answers, the versatility of this deck makes tower trades an extremely viable option. And even in a 2-tower game where you're gonna have to take a second arena tower, Lava Hound is just as effective as it normally is, if not even more deadly. Number 5, Giant Skeleton Hog Cycle. Oh my goodness, Giant Skeleton has somehow made its way into Hog Cycle decks. That's right, you might be looking at this deck and thinking, what in the world kind of 2.6 deck is this? But I'll tell you what, it's actually 3.1 average elixir. Aside from that, this is sort of the newest version of Hog decks, which is extremely weird. It's a Hog Cycle deck with all the same cycle elements you'd expect, but then all of a sudden there's just a Giant Skeleton in there. So starting things off, this deck still has relatively the same playstyle as a traditional Hog Cycle deck. You really just have the Hog, the Earthquake, and the Log, and the whole idea is that you're trying to outcycle your opponent's Hog counters. The defense of this deck is where things get a little bit tricky and a little bit interesting. Of course, it's a cycle deck, so certain defenses are going to be a little bit more difficult to pull off, but this variation of the deck actually makes it a little bit easier because you do have some of those heavier units like the Archer Queen and like the Giant Skeleton. So of course, the core of the defense is still the same, right? You're cycling your cannon and cheap units to distract your opponent's pushes, but you also have the Archer Queen for high output damage and the Giant Skeleton as sort of a lane clogger This deck does not have a medium spell in a sense that it doesn't have like a fireball or a poison to use on defense, and the Giant Skeleton kind of serves as that sort of medium spell. Another important thing to note in this deck is that just like any other Hog Cycle deck, there is only one air counter in this deck and the Archer Queen. So again, if you're against an air deck, it's important that you either save the Archer Queen for these air pushes or pressure the opposite lane with your Hog Rider and Giant Skeleton so that the opponent cannot build up a big enough air push that you cannot defend. Last but not least, you have the Earthquake and the Log as spell cycle. This deck is still a cycle deck after all, so in double and triple elixir time, spell cycling is an extremely effective and almost necessary win condition for you to take down the opponent's towers. All in all, a little bit of a faster and, in my opinion, more difficult to pick up deck, but if you're already familiar with the cycle archetype, then this is definitely a good choice for you.